The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath by H.P. Lovecraft. Part 5. It was not yet evening when the dark ship anchored beside a jutting quay of stone, and all the sailors and traders filed ashore and through the arched gate into the city. The streets of that city were paved with onyx, and some of them were wide and straight, whilst others were crooked and narrow. The houses near the water were lower than the rest, and bore above their curiously arched doorways certain signs of gold, said to be in honour of the respective small gods that favoured each. The captain of the ship took Carter to an old sea tavern where flocked the mariners of quaint countries, and promised that he would next day show him the wonders of the twilight city, and lead him to the taverns of onyx miners by the northern wall. And evening fell, and little bronze lamps were lighted, and the sailors in that tavern sang songs of remote places. But when from its high tower the great bell shivered over the city, and the peal of the horns and viols and voices rose cryptical in answer thereto, all ceased their songs or tales, and bowed silent, till the last echo died away. For there is a wonder and strangeness on the twilight city of Inganok, and men fear to be lax in its rites, lest a doom and a vengeance lurk unsuspectedly close. Far in the shadows of that tavern, Carter saw a squat form he did not like, for it was unmistakably that of the old slant-eyed merchant he had seen so long before in the taverns of Lothleen, who was reputed to trade with the horrible stone villages of Leng, which no healthy folk visit, and whose evil fires are seen at night from afar. And even to have dealt with that high priest not to be described, which wears a yellow silken mask over its face, and dwells all alone in a prehistoric stone monastery. This man had seemed to show a queer gleam of knowing when Carter asked the traders of Lothleen about the cold waste and Kadath, and somehow his presence in dark and haunted Inganok, so close to the wonders of the north, was not a reassuring thing. He slipped wholly out of sight before Carter could speak to him, and sailors later said that he had come with a yak caravan from some point not well determined, bearing the colossal and rich-flavoured eggs of the rumoured shantak bird, to trade for the dexterous jade goblets that merchants brought from Elornek. On the following morning, the ship captain led Carter through the onyx streets of Inganok, dark under their twilight sky. The inlaid doors and figured house fronts, carven balconies, and crystal-paint oriels all gleamed with a sombre and polished loveliness. And now and then a plaza would open up with black pillars, colonnades, and the statues of curious beings, both human and fabulous. Some of the vistas down long and unbending streets, or through side alleys and over bulbous domes, spires, and arabesque roofs, were weird and beautiful beyond words, and nothing was more splendid than the massive height of the great central temple of the Elder Ones, with its 16 carven sides, its flattened dome, and its lofty pinnacled belfry, overtopping all else, and majestic wherever its foreground. And always to the east, far beyond the city walls and the leagues of pasture land, rose the gaunt grey sides of those topless and impassable peaks, across which hideous Leng was said to lie. The captain took Carter to the mighty temple, which is set with its walled garden in a great round plaza, whence the streets go, as spokes from a wheel's hub. The 7 arched gates of that garden, each having over it a carven face like those on the city's gates, are always open, and the people roam reverently at will down the tiled paths and through the little lanes lined with grotesque termini and the shrines of modest gods. And there are fountains, pools, and basins there to reflect the frequent blaze of the tripods on the high balcony, all of onyx and having in them small luminous fish, taken by divers from the lower bowers of ocean. When the deep clang from the temple's belfry shivers over the garden and the city, and the answer of the horns and the viols and voices peals out from the 7 lodges by the garden gates, there issue From the 7 doors of the temple, long columns of masked and hooded priests in black, bearing at arm's length before them great golden bowls, from which a curious steam rises, and all the 7 columns strut peculiarly in single file, legs thrown far forward without bending the knees, down the walks that lead to the 7 lodges, wherein they disappear and do not appear again. It is said that subterranean paths connect the lodges with the temple, and that the long files of priests return through them, nor is it unwhispered that deep flights of onyx steps go down to mysteries that are never told, but only a few are those who hint that the priests in the masked and hooded columns are not human priests. Carter did not enter the temple because none but the veiled king is permitted to do that, but before he left the garden, the hour of the bell came, and he heard the shivering clang deafeningly above him, and the wailing of the horns and viols, and voices loud from the lodges by the gates. And down by the 7 great walks stalked the long files of bowl-bearing priests, in their singular way, giving to the traveler a fear which human priests do not often give. When the last of them had vanished, he left that garden, noting as he did so a spot on the pavement over which the bowls had passed. Even the ship captain did not like that spot, and hurried him on toward the hill, whereon the veiled king's palace rises many-domed and marvelous. The ways to the onyx palace are steep and narrow, all but that broad curving one, where the king and his companions ride on yaks, or in yak-drawn chariots. Carter and his guide climbed up an alley that was all steps, between inlaid walls bearing strange signs in gold, and under balconies and oriels whence sometimes floated soft strains of music or breaths of exotic fragrance. Always ahead loomed those Titan walls, mighty buttresses and clustered and bulbous domes, for which the veiled king's palace is famous, and at length they passed under a great black arch, and emerged in the gardens of the monarch's pleasure. There, Carter paused in faintness at so much of beauty. For the onyx terraces and colonnaded walks, the gay parterres and delicate flowering trees espaliered to golden lattices, the brazen urns and tripods with cunning bas-reliefs, the pedestaled and almost breathing statues of veined black marble, the basalt-bottomed lagoons and tiled fountains with luminous fish, the tiny temples of iridescent singing birds atop carven columns, the marvelous scroll-work of the great bronze gates, and the blossoming vines trained along every inch of the polished walls, all joined to form a sight whose loveliness was beyond reality, and half fabulous even in the land of dream. There it shimmered like a vision under the gray twilight sky, with the domed and fretted magnificence of the palace ahead, and the fantastic silhouette of the distant impassable peaks on the right. And ever the small birds in the fountain sang, while the perfume of rare blossoms spread like a veil over that incredible garden. No other human presence was there, and Carter was glad it was so. Then they turned and descended again the onyx alley of steps, for the palace itself no visitor may enter, and it is not well to look too long and steadily at the great central dome, since it is said to house the archaic father of all the rumored Shantak birds, and to send out queer dreams to the curious. After that, the captain took Carter to the north quarter of the town, near the gate of the caravans, where are the taverns of the yak merchants and the onyx miners, and there in a low sealed inn of quarrymen they said farewell, for business called the captain, whilst Carter was eager to talk with miners about the north. There were many men in that inn, and the traveller was not long in speaking to some of them, saying that he was an old miner of onyx and anxious to know somewhat of Ingannocht's quarries, but all that he learned was not much more than he knew before, for the miners were timid and evasive about the cold desert to the north and the quarry that no man visits. They had fears of fabled emissaries from around the mountains where Leng is said to lie, and of evil presences and nameless sentinels far north among the scattered rocks. And they whispered also that the rumored Shantak birds are no wholesome things, it being indeed for the best that no man has ever truly seen one. For that fabled father of Shantaks in the king's dome is fed in the dark. The next day, saying that he wished to look over all the various mines for himself, and to visit the scattered farms and quaint onyx villages of Inganock, Carter hired a yak and stuffed great leathern saddlebags for a journey. Beyond the gate of the caravans, the road lay straight betwixt tilled fields with many odd farmhouses crowned by low domes. At some of these houses the seeker stopped to ask questions. Once, finding a host so austere and reticent, and so full of unplaced majesty, like to that in the huge features on Nagronic, that he felt certain he had come at last upon one of the great ones themselves, or upon one with full 9/10 of their blood, dwelling amongst men. And to that austere and reticent cotter, he was careful to speak very well of the gods, and to praise all the blessings they had ever accorded him. That night, Carter camped in a roadside meadow beneath a great lagoth tree to which he tied his yak, and in the morning resumed his northward pilgrimage. At about 10 o'clock, he reached the small dome village of Urg, where traders rest and miners tell their tales, and paused in its taverns till noon. It is here that the great caravan road turns west towards Salarn. But Carter kept on north by the quarry road. All the afternoon he followed that rising road, which was somewhat narrower than the great highway, and which now led through a region with more rocks than tilled fields. And by evening, as the low hills on his left had risen into sizable black cliffs, so that he knew he was close to the mining country, all the while the great gaunt sides of the impassable mountains towered afar off at his right. And the farther he went, the worse tales he heard of them, from the scattered farmers and traders and drivers of lumbering onyx carts along the way. On the second night, he camped in the shadow of a large black crag, tethering his yak to a stake driven in the ground. He observed the great phosphorescence of the clouds at this northerly point, and more than once thought he saw dark shapes outlined against them. And on the third morning he came in sight of the first onyx quarry, and greeted the men who there labored with picks and chisels. Before evening he had passed 11 quarries, the land being here given over altogether to onyx cliffs and boulders, with no vegetation at all, but only great rocky fragments scattered about a floor of black earth, with the grey impassable peaks always rising, gaunt and sinister, on his right. The third night he spent in a camp of quarrymen, whose flickering fires cast weird reflections on the polished cliffs to the west, and they sang many songs and told many tales, showing such strange knowledge of the olden days and the habits of gods that Carter could see they held many latent memories of their sires, the great ones. They asked him whither he went, and cautioned him not to go too far to the north, but he replied that he was seeking new cliffs of onyx, and would take no more risk than were common among prospectors. In the morning he bade them adieu, and rode on into the darkening north, where they had warned him he would find the feared and unvisited quarry, whence hands older than men's hands had wrenched prodigious blocks. But he did not like it when, turning back to wave a last farewell, he thought he saw approaching the camp that squat and evasive old merchant with slanting eyes, whose conjectured traffic with Leng was the gossip of distant Delothleen. After 2 more quarries, the inhabited part of Inganot seemed to end, and the road narrowed to a steeply rising yak path among forbidding black cliffs. Always on the right towered the gaunt and distant peaks, and as Carter climbed farther and farther into this untraversed realm, he found it grew darker and cooler. Soon he perceived that there were no prints of feet or hooves on the black path beneath, and realized that he was indeed come to strange and deserted ways of elder time. Once in a while a raven would croak far overhead, and now and then a flapping behind some vast rock would make him think uncomfortably of the rumoured shantak bird. But in the main he was alone with his shaggy steed, and it troubled him to observe that this excellent yak become more and more reluctant to advance, and more disposed to snort affrighted at any small noise along the route. The path now contracted between sable and glistening walls, and began to display an even greater steepness than before. It was a bad footing, and the yak often slipped on the stony fragments strewn thickly about. In 2 hours, Carter saw ahead a definite crest, beyond which was nothing but dull gray sky, and blessed the prospect of a level or downward course. To reach this crest, however, was no easy task, for the way had grown nearly perpendicular and was perilous with loose black gravel and small stones. Eventually, Carter dismounted and led his dubious yak, pulling very hard when the animal balked or stumbled, and keeping his own footing as best he might. Then suddenly he came to the top and saw beyond and gasped at what he saw. The path indeed led straight ahead and slightly down, with the same lines of high natural walls as before, but on the left hand there opened a monstrous space, vast acres in extent, where some archaic power had riven and rent the native cliffs of onyx in the forms of a giant's quarry. Far back into the solid precipice ran that cyclopean gouge, and deep down within earth's bowels its lower delvings yawned. It was no quarry of man, and the concave sides were scarred with great squares yards wide, which told of the size of the blocks once hewn by nameless hands and chisels. High over its jagged rim, huge ravens flapped and croaked, and vague whirrings in the unseen depths told of bats or urhags or less mentionable presences haunting the endless blackness. There Carter stood in the narrow way, amidst the twilight, with the rocky path sloping down before him, tall onyx cliffs on his right that led on as far as he could see, and tall cliffs on the left chopped off just ahead to make that terrible and unearthly quarry. All at once, the yak uttered a cry and burst from his control, leaping past him and darting on in a panic till it vanished down the narrow slope toward the north. Stones kicked by its flying hooves fell over the brink of the quarry and lost themselves in the dark, without any sound of striking bottom. But Carter ignored the perils of that scanty path as he raced breathlessly after the flying steed. Soon the left-hand cliffs resumed their course, making the way once more a narrow lane, and still the traveler leaped on after the yak, whose great wide prints told of its desperate flight. Once he thought he heard the hoof-beats of the frightened beast and doubled his speed from this encouragement. He was covering miles, and little by little the way was broadening in front till he knew he must emerge on the cold and dreaded desert to the north. The gaunt grey flanks of the distant impassable peaks were again visible above the right-hand crags, and ahead were the rocks and boulders of an open space which was clearly a foretaste of the dark and limitless plain. And once more those hoof-beats sounded in his ears, plainer than before, but this time giving terror instead of encouragement, because he realized that they were not the frightened hoof-beats of his fleeing yak. These beats were ruthless and purposeful, and they were behind him. Carter's pursuit of the yak became now a flight from an unseen thing, for though he dared not glance over his shoulder, he felt that the presence behind him could be nothing wholesome or mentionable. His yak must have heard or felt it first, and he did not like to ask himself whether it had followed him from the haunts of men or had floundered up out of that black quarry pit. Meanwhile, the cliffs had been left behind, so that the oncoming night fell over a great waste of sand and spectral rocks, wherein all paths were lost. He could not see the hoof-prints of his yak, but always from behind him there came that detestable clopping, mingled now and then with what he fancied were titanic flappings and whirrings. That he was losing ground seemed unhappily clear to him, and he knew he was hopelessly lost in this broken and blasted desert of meaningless rock and untraveled sands. Only these remote and impassable peaks on the right gave him any sense of direction, and even they were less clear as the gray twilight waned and the sickly phosphorescence of the clouds took its place. Then, dimly and misty, in the darkling north before him, he glimpsed a terrible thing. He had thought it for some moments a range of black mountains, but now he saw it was something more. The phosphorescence of the brooding clouds showed it plainly, and even silhouetted parts of it as low vapors glowed behind. How distant it was he could not tell, but it must have been very far. It was thousands of feet high, stretching in a great concave arc from the grey impassable peaks to the unimagined westward spaces, and had once indeed been a ridge of mighty onyx hills, but now those hills were hills no more, for some great hand greater than man's had touched them. Silent they squatted there atop the world like wolves or ghouls, crowned with clouds and mists and guarding the secrets of the north forever. All in a great half-circle they squatted, those dog-like mountains carven into monstrous watching statues, and their right hands were raised in menace against mankind. It was only the flickering light of the clouds that made their mitred double heads seem to move, but as Carter stumbled on, he saw arise from their shadowy laps great forms whose motions were no delusion. Winged and whirring, those forms grew larger each moment, and the traveler knew his stumbling was at an end. They were not any birds or bats known elsewhere on earth or in dreamland, for they were larger than elephants and had heads like horses. Carter knew that they must be the Shantak birds of ill rumor, and wondered no more what evil guardians and nameless sentinels made men avoid the boreal rock desert. And as he stopped in final resignation, he dared at last to look behind him, where indeed was trotting the squat, slant-eyed trader of evil legend, grinning astride a lean yak and leading on a noxious horde of leering Shantaks, to whose wings still clung the rhyme and nitre of the nether pits. Trapped though he was by fabulous and hippocephalic winged nightmares that pressed around in great unholy circles, Carter did not lose consciousness. Lofty and horrible, those titan gargoyles towered above him, while the slant-eyed merchant leaped down from his yak and stood grinning before the captive. Then the man motioned Carter to mount one of the repugnant Shantaks, helping him up as his judgment struggled with his loathing. It was hard work ascending, for the Shantak bird has scales instead of feathers, and those scales are very slippery. Once he was seated, the slant-eyed man hopped up behind him, leaving the yak to be led away northward, toward the ring of carven mountains by one of the incredible bird colossi. There now followed a hideous whirl through frigid space, endlessly up and eastward toward the gaunt grey flanks of those impassable mountains, beyond which Leng was said to lie. Far above the clouds they flew, till at last there lay beneath them those fabled summits which the folk of Inganok have never seen, and which lie always in high vortices of gleaming mist. Carter beheld them very plainly as they passed below, and saw upon their topmost peaks strange caves which made him think of those on the Grannoch. But he did not question his captor about these things when he noticed that both the man and the horse-headed Shantak appeared oddly fearful of them, hurrying past nervously and showing great tension until they were left far in the rear. The Shantak now flew lower, revealing beneath the canopy of cloud a grey barren plain, whereon at great distances shone little feeble fires. As they descended, there appeared at intervals lone huts of granite and bleak stone villages whose tiny windows glowed with pallid light. And there came upon those huts and villages a shrill droning of pipes and a nauseous rattle of crotala, which proved at once that Inganot's people are right in their geographic rumors, for travelers have heard such sounds before and know that they float only from the cold desert plateau, which healthy folk never visit, that haunted place of evil and mystery which is Leng. Around the feeble fires dark forms were dancing, and Carter was curious as to what manner of beings they might be, for no healthy folk have ever been to Leng, and the place is known only by its fires and stone huts as seen from afar. Very slowly and awkwardly did those forms leap, and with an insane twisting and bending not good to behold, so that Carter did not wonder at the monstrous evil imputed to them by vague legend, or the fear in which all dreamland holds their abhorrent frozen plateau. As the Shantak flew lower, the repulsiveness of it the dancers, became tinged with a certain hellish familiarity, and the prisoner kept straining his eyes and racking his memory for clues to where he had seen such creatures before. They leaped as though they had hooves instead of feet, and seemed to wear a sort of wig or headpiece with small horns. Of other clothing they had none, but most of them were quite furry. Behind they had dwarfish tails, and when they glanced upward, he saw the excessive width of their mouths. Then he knew what they were, and that they did not wear any wigs or headpieces after all, for the cryptic folk of Leng were of one race with the uncomfortable merchants of the black galleys that traded rubies at the Loth Lean, those not quite human merchants who are the slaves of the monstrous moon things. They were indeed the same dark folk who had shanghaied Carter on their noisome galleys so long ago, and whose kith he had seen driven in herds about the unclean wharves of that accursed lunar city, with the leaner ones toiling and the fatter ones taken away in crates for other needs of their polypous and amorphous masters. Now he saw where such ambiguous creatures came from, and shuddered at the thought that Leng must be known to these formless abominations from the moon. But the Shantak flew on past the fires and stone huts, and the less-than-human dancers, and soared over sterile hills of grey granite and dim wastes of rock and ice and snow. Day came, and the phosphorescence of low clouds gave place to the misty twilight of that northern world. And still the vile bird winged meaningly through the cold and silence. At times the slant-eyed man talked with his steed in a hateful and guttural language, and the Shantak would answer with tittering tones that rasped like the scratching of ground glass. All this while the land was getting higher, and finally they came to a wind-swept tableland, which seemed the very roof of a blasted and tenantless world. There, all alone in the hush and the dusk and the cold, rose the uncouth stones of a squat, windowless building, around which a circle of crude monoliths stood. In all this arrangement there was nothing human, and Carter surmised from old tales that he was indeed come to that most dreadful and legendary of all places, the remote and prehistoric monastery, wherein dwells uncompanioned the high priest not to be described, which wears a yellow silken mask over its face and prays to the other gods, and their crawling chaos, Nyarlathotep. The loathsome bird now settled to the ground, and the slant-eyed man hopped down and helped his captive alight. Of the purpose of his seizure, Carter now felt very sure, for clearly the slant-eyed merchant was an agent of the darker powers, eager to drag before his masters a mortal whose presumption had aimed at finding of unknown Kadath, and the saying of a prayer before the faces of the great ones in their onyx castle. It seems likely that this merchant had caused his former capture by the slaves of the moon things in Loth Lean, and that he now meant to do what the rescuing cats had baffled, taking the victim to some dread rendezvous with monstrous Nyarlathotep, and telling him what boldness the seeking of unknown Kadath had been tried. Leng and the cold waste north of Inganot must be close to the other gods, and there the passes to Kadath are well guarded. The slant-eyed man was small, but the great hippocephalic bird was there to see he was obeyed. So Carter followed where he led, and passed within the circle of standing rocks, and into the low arched doorway of that windowless stone monastery. There were no lights inside, but the evil merchant lit a small clay lamp bearing morbid bas-reliefs, and prodded his prisoner on through mazes of narrowing, winding corridors. On the walls of the corridors were painted frightful scenes older than history, and in a style unknown to the archaeologists of Earth. After countless eons, their pigments were brilliant still, for the cold and dryness of hideous Leng kept alive many primal things. Carter saw them fleetingly in the rays of that dim and moving lamp, and shuddered at the tale they told.